Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. We are so happy to have all of you back here today. We're very excited to have Dr. Marcia Eckert here for our first webinar of 2022. Today's webinar is presented by SpedNet Wilton in partnership with Wilton Public Schools and Darien CPAC, and we're grateful for their partnership. Today, Dr. Eckert will discuss Is She on the Spectrum? Identifying and helping girls with Asperger's and nonverbal learning disabilities. Dr. Eckert is a licensed psychologist for 35 years. She provides therapy and consultations with parents and schools for students with autism spectrum disorders, NVLD, ADHD, and executive function issues. She has a specialty in diagnosing and working with individuals with spectrum challenges and NVLD, such as social skills, anxiety, inflexibility, and depression. She has written and lectured extensively about the challenges of identifying girls and women on the spectrum who have not been previously diagnosed or understood. For more information about Dr. Eckert, please visit our website at www.spednetwilton.org. Our SpedNet Wilton board is here today, including Eve Kessler, Executive Director and co-founder of SpedNet Wilton, co-presidents Carolina Corrigan and I am Janine Kelly. Just some housekeeping, please check out our new and improved website. Again, www.spednetwilton.org. We're constantly looking for new and improved ways to keep you informed about special education matters in ways that are user-friendly. Also available on our website is our guide to special education, bringing knowledge to the table, how to be an effective advocate for your child. It breaks down the complex special education process in a way that's easy to understand, so please check it out. Just a few ground rules. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions into the Q&A and not into the chat because it's easier to keep track of the questions as they're answered that way. The chat sometimes disappears, so we can't really keep track of the questions that way. If we run out of time and don't get to your questions, you can email them to us, and Dr. Eckert has generously offered to answer them via email. Also, be mindful that this is an open forum and we're recording. We can't guarantee confidentiality, so please be careful not to reveal any private information that you do not want out there in the public forum. Also, and most importantly, any information provided in this presentation by Dr. Eckert or the SpedNet Wilton board is not intended to be legal or therapeutic advice. The information and discussion are for general information purposes only. And with that being said, I will turn the reins over to Dr. Eckert.
Well, good morning, and I'd like to thank SpedNet Wilton and SpedNet of Darien for inviting me to be with you this morning. If you look at the first screen, you'll see Asperger's is in parentheses. And the reason Asperger's is in parentheses is because they don't call it Asperger's anymore. They call it autism level 1. But it's important to know that there's a group of kids and adults who are on the autism spectrum who are quite verbal and who look, I would say, different. And so that's why I have Asperger's here, so you will know what it is I'm talking about. I'm not referring to the children who are identified at a young age, obviously, because what we're talking about is getting those kids who are missed. So talking about kids who are missed, I thought it would be good to do it this way. I'd like you to meet Abigail. Abigail is bright. Abigail is very verbal. She probably started talking at a very young age. And she's the sweetie little kid, but she's really quirky. She just doesn't fit in. And so from an early age, you might notice that you set up the play dates, but maybe they don't go that well, or she's not in middle school, she's not part of a girl group. She might not get invited to parties. She might, you just sort of see issues, but the reason these kids do well with adults is because if you're not being sort of totally right on socially, adults kind of fill in the blanks, and little kids have very few expectations. So, but Abigail sometimes will do things where you figure she's just not getting it. She'll go on talking when people really aren't with her, or if a teacher is in the classroom and the teacher kind of gives her a glare or raises an eyebrow or something like that, she doesn't get it. And And she might come home and say, I don't know why the teacher yelled at me. She said that she'd given me warnings. She didn't. And the fact is, most of the warnings weren't verbal. Abigail can be really possessive of her friends. She doesn't have very many, and she doesn't get it that her friend would have other friends. And I once worked with a little girl who would push her friend because the friend wanted to play with somebody else. And Abigail also Abigail has her own mind, and it's difficult to change it. I talk about these kids as having railroad track thinking. They are on one track, and it's like trying to change the way a train goes to get them to change their mind. Abigail might be very, very observant of every rule, or Abigail might not do the things that don't make sense to her. I had one little girl that I saw who was in a school where they sat with teachers at the table, and they had a rule that the kids had to eat their dessert after they ate their sandwich. And she thought that was a stupid rule because she always ate everything, it all went in her tummy. But the fact is, they had a rule, and if you didn't do it, you got sent to the principal. So she spent a lot of time in the principal's office. She has stuff that really interests her, which is generally a girl thing. It's not something that's strange, but she's super interested in it. Or maybe a series of things where whatever it is, she's really taking a deep dive. And if you say to her something like, she does a piano recital and she does it beautifully, and you say, well, couldn't you have done that better? Meaning you were great. She doesn't get it, and she thinks that you were criticizing her. Abigail has been known to be blunt, shall we put it this way. I have, one kid who will tell you, if I had one girl I worked with and she wanted to know about gender identity and she was wondering about hers, I gave her a whole thing about how we grow and develop and everything. And she looked at me and she said, well, that certainly wasn't useful. So they will, a girl like Abigail will be honest with you. And she's detail oriented. She picks up everything. She might not get the main idea of what you want, but she is like, every single thing is in her mind. And I often have parents coming and telling me that this kid goes from 0 to 60 with out of the blue. And can I please fix that? She might have things like spills at the table or bumping into people or trouble tying her shoes or have trouble riding a bike or trouble handwriting or buttoning some kind of motor skills. And Abigail gets teased or bullied because she's different. The girls will give her a hard time, and sometimes even teachers give her a hard time because she's doing the things that we're talking about doing here. And so what does she get called? Well, if she's not doing what someone wants, she gets called oppositional, or she gets called avoidant. I mean, we have a behavioral analysis. She's not doing what they told her. So she's either attention seeking or avoidant, right? Manipulative, rude. She gets called a lot of very negative things. And this is one of my most important slides because Abigail isn't any of these things. Abigail is coming out of her own way of processing the world. She has no malicious intent. And but if she's told these things often enough, if she is hearing that she is all these negative things, she's going to start believing it. And she's going to start feeling about herself the way you would if you were constantly being criticized and you were constantly being told that there's something wrong with you. And in fact, the issue is that this Abigail of ours is wired differently. And I say that as a metaphor. We're not talking literally about wires for anybody who's literal, but she processes the world differently. The thing that's interesting is that we accept the idea of diversity in just about everything. I mean, I have brown hair. I bet some of you out there have blonde hair. Maybe somebody has red hair. Maybe some of you are, incredibly athletic. Lord knows I'm not. We accept all kinds of diversity, but somehow when it comes to how we process our neurodiversity, that suddenly you all have to be the same. You all have to do it the same. But neurodiverse kids are very common. ADHD kids process differently. So do children who have learning differences. There's many kinds of neurodiversity, and different kinds of neurodiversity have challenges, and the diagnostic criteria tend to focus on the challenges, but they also have gifts. There's positive things that come with being neurodiverse. But why am I talking about autism and NLD? Because there are a lot of kids who would come under these umbrellas and who are not recognized. Why? And why wouldn't they know what you're talking about if you say, is my kid nonverbal learning disability? And you go to a therapist and you say, well, my daughter has nonverbal learning disability. And the therapist looks like you're out of your mind. Well, the trouble with NLD, and I'm going to call it NLD as opposed to NLVD, just out of habit, is that it's a neuropsych profile, which means on testing, she has very strong verbal skills, but weak visual skills, visual memory, visual spatial, visual motor processing. She might be a slow processor. So it's a testing pattern. It's not a clinical psychiatric diagnosis, and it's not a learning difference either. So nonverbal learning disability is a totally terrible name for what we have here. And many girls who have spectrum traits blend, that you can't tell them, they don't really look that different. So they are, they're just not recognized. So there's a lot of overlap. They both have social issues. They both need routine. They both have, you can see the issues here. They both can be this literal, like Abby is. They can have sensory issues.
Per the syllabus, this class will focus on the study of normative ethics, i.e., of course, by being late, somebody missed my announcement that I have a no laptop policy. If the thought of writing with your hand overwhelms you, then go back to first grade. Normative ethics is the study of how one ought to act, morally speaking. Will we touch on meta-ethics? Yes. Applied ethics? Inevitably. Historically, there are multiple. Oh, excellent. I'm just tickled to hear from you again.
Thank you. Can you please slow down, and can you repeat the definition of normative ethics and slow down?
Sure. In fact, why don't we all stop until you're ready?
Great.
So this is a courtesy of the producer of Atypical, which is a wonderful TV show if you haven't seen it. But this is what autistic boys look like, right? They're boys, first of all. They're kind of nerdy. He doesn't pick up. He doesn't understand the social rule. Do you talk to teachers that way? No. You don't know it in this particular piece, but he's fascinated by penguins, which is kind of weird. And he's kind of weird. You saw the look he got from that girl who was like, what is your problem? And he certainly is literal. She says, well, we'll stop for you. And he says, thank you. He has no idea she's being sarcastic. So this is our picture of what autistic what they call high functioning autistic kids look like. Nerdy, weird, maybe interested in something really strange. But newsflash, girls are different. Girls are different in every other way. We would be different in this. So why? Well, for one thing, girls look more social. From a very young age, they pick up on how to behave socially. So if you're looking at a playground and you're looking at these girls, they hang out where the other girls are, but they may not know how to join. They may not know how to be with the other girls, and the other girls know this. But if you're an adult who is not trained is just looking, they're not going to notice. Their interests aren't weird. They're not interested in penguins. They're probably interested in animals or art or Taylor Swift or something like that. That doesn't stick out. And so what we have is that they're missed. It used to be thought, and these data are on spectrum girls, that boys outnumber girls 4-1, but research shows that it's really more like closer to 2-1. And the thing is, when you think of kids who are on the spectrum, they all have the same traits. These nerdy boys, as you saw with the boy from Autistic, have the same traits in terms of social, in terms of literal, in terms of processing. He's struggling to process fast enough. But the girls get missed by the gold standard tests like the ADOS because they've learned to do the social things. And especially, as I'm sure many of you know, a girl who does well academically can just fall through the cracks because she's not being distracting, and she's not making everybody, she's not disruptive. And if you're not disruptive, then, you're fine. Some of these girls get picked up around 10 to 14, because that's when girl groups get incredibly complicated. And if any of you remember being in middle school or 10 to 14, these, the queen bees and wannabes, they are such a pain in the butt. But the fact is that these girls won't necessarily pick up that eye roll. They won't pick up the body language that says, I'm excluding you. So they're going to be surprised. They're going to be hurt. And they are just, but they are excluded, or it becomes more obvious that they have problems. But many of them don't get picked up, again, because they're doing well enough by the version, even though social emotional goals are part of the definition of what students are supposed to be doing. The fact is, if you're doing well, you can fall between the cracks. So this actually is a picture of my granddaughter's birthday party, but it's a good example of how girls are surrounded by girls. So if one of these girls is on the spectrum or NLD, she gets to see all these other girls, and she knows how to mimic the behavior, but she's still missing these cues, and she's missing those rules. So we have social challenges, and I see kids who are NLD or on the spectrum, and they want to be with people, but they don't quite know how to approach, and they don't read how you have the back and forth of communication. Kids on the spectrum are very direct, and they have a hard time with a lot of the talk where it doesn't really mean anything. Hi, how are you? Nobody wants to know how you are. What you're up to. They don't want to know what you're up to, and they get confused by this. If you miss social rules, you do things wrong. You say things at the wrong time. That, the boy in atypical, you don't say that to a teacher. And there are issues with friendships, and you expect people to be truthful because these kids have incredible integrity. They're incredibly truthful. That doesn't mean once in a while they don't say, I did my homework, but in general, these kids have a very hard time not being truthful, and they expect everybody else will be, which can make it very painful if you're with other kids and they're not telling the truth. And then you discover that. And for girls are expected to know these rules. It's expected that if a boy doesn't, then boys will be boys, but girls aren't. We don't expect that of them. And so people are judgmental. And so Abigail is getting judged all the time. And teachers will be like the teacher was in there with an atypical. Teachers will be bullies as well as kids, I'm afraid, and see Abigail's rudeness or Abigail's oppositionalism, of the fact she doesn't want to do things, or that she's reacting and she doesn't know, the teacher doesn't know why. They will say, I've actually had kids where the teacher has said, just stop being so strange, be like other kids. And that's really not helpful. So the problem is these kids who are less socially impaired than diagnosed autistic kids and more intelligent are more teased. because they're just seen as weird. They're just seen as different. And so how do we help the kids with social challenges? I'm going to try to talk about challenges and how we help them. Well, first of all, it's not a surprise. It's amazing that often we treat every time as a surprise. And so if a child has social challenges and doesn't know how to enter and gets overwhelmed in social situations, you know that. And so anticipate it. You may have to explain what's going on. But what's important is that we respect the child's needs and the child's point of view. I had a parent bring me a child and say, look, we have a family reunion coming up. And so she's going to have to be in a room with lots of people. Somehow everyone hangs out where the food is. So it's a very crowded, very noisy room, pre-pandemic, of course, and fix her. Make her so this works. And it's not going to work. You know that she gets overwhelmed by this. So maybe have her spend time alone with grandpa and grandpa, or time alone with this set of cousins, so that she's not overwhelmed by the social situation. And it's important to think about what Abigail's goals are. We don't just sort of push her in and say, okay, I want you to be this way with Aunt so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so. If she really experiences them as negative toward her, you have to understand how does Abigail feel, and create strategies that work for Abigail. So we're going to help her join. I can't tell you how often the idea is, if we just put these kids in Girl Scouts, or we just put them in this group, everything's going to be fine. Unless the Girl Scout leader knows how to facilitate a girl joining and help kind of explain if someone is not getting some of these things, we think that it's going to work, and she's going to have the same problems there she has everywhere else. So often what we do is we teach them social skills, and we use social stories to teach them the right way to do things. But a question I want to tell you about is the issue of social skills in masking, especially for the spectrum kids, because we want her to know what to do to achieve her outcome. And so if she wants to make friends, there are certain things that send a message that I want to be a friend. At the same time, we want to work with her to do it in a way that works for her. And we want to recognize what she wants to do. And so sometimes teaching social skills, or teaching them a particular set of things to do that may have nothing to do with what the child wants to do. I know one girl who was told there was an IEP that she would approach 3 out of 5 times. She would approach somebody and she would do this. She was with a group of kids who were really rejecting of her. Why on earth would she want to approach those kids? She preferred reading a book. So we have to talk about, well, what's her experience? What might she do in this group? And it's important to talk about boundaries, and I'll get to that in a second. So what is masking? Masking is when you learn what's expected of you. So you make eye contact, you smile, you say these things, but sometimes what happens, especially with the spectrum girls, is they're so busy thinking of, what do I do with my face? Do I have the right expression on? Is my body in the right position? What do they want me to say? What is the right thing to say? Because remember, these girls are detail oriented, and it's hard for them to understand that every situation is different. And so what I say to this one is, well, what do I say to that one? That they're so busy trying to figure this out that they can't even think about what they want to think. They're so busy thinking about, how do I put on what people want of me? And so it's important to think about helping them express their own ideas as well as the outcome they want. If I want to be a friend, then I need to pay attention. I need to listen. But how do I do that in a way that works for me? Because this masking is very stressful, and women who are adult, who are taught to always be thinking about, what am I supposed to be doing? How do I arrange my face? are so stressed out and so exhausted that I have women who are incredibly successful and they have high positions in corporations who literally have to take the entire evening to recover from being in an activity where they have to do this. There's also issues with safety that I want you to consider, and this is as girls get older, but even when they're younger, these kids want friends, all of them want friends, but they don't understand that people don't tell the truth, so they're vulnerable to being manipulated. If they're little, they might be told, well, if you do this, then I'll be your friend. And the kid is just really setting them up. One kid who was told, you know, if you want to be my friend, then I want you to do this to that kid and hit him with a towel, or, you know, or throw this. And of course, our kids are the ones that do it when the teacher's looking and the kid gets in trouble. And no, that kid is not a friend. And these kids can end up in compromising situations, whether it's getting in trouble at school for doing that, or if they're older, being in this picture, you can see they're being told, well, if you're my friend, you're going to join us in having wine, or even unfortunately in being sexually abused. I had one girl who was NLD, and she desperately wanted to have friends. And a boy in middle school said, if you take pictures of your body and send them to me, I will be your boyfriend. And I don't need to tell you what he did with those pictures. So what are other wiring differences they have? I talked a lot about social, and these are the criteria for autism. But as I've said, the NLD kids look very similar. And so inflexibility. Well, if you think about it, these kids, these particular kids on the spectrum and the NLD kids are processing differently because what they're processing through is language. They are missing what's not verbalized, and that's not just visual cues, that's things like tone of voice. So if you put on that angry tone, they may miss it and not realize that you're pissed. Or the opposite, I've had kids where they'll come in and they'll tell me, my mom's always yelling at me. I have mom come in and mom is just saying something in a serious voice, and they say, see, she's yelling, and they're not getting tone. And so these kids are processing, but missing a very high number of the signals that are coming in. So what they want is a way of navigating this. And the way of navigating this is to have predictability where you know what you do. And so they have a really hard time if we change things and we either have them transition, we expect them to go from this to that very quickly, or they have environmental things where it's constantly changing. And guess what? The world is constantly changing, whether it's what you're being asked to do, or whether it's the social demand or some other demand. And so these kids may seem black and white, and that they need to do things in a particular way. It's because that's how they navigate. It's not just because they're being attention seeking or they're being manipulative or they're self-focused. So we provide structure, we preview things. We say, okay, in half an hour, we're going to have to leave. And probably most of you who have kids like this know that you have to preview, but sometimes a transition comes up and there is no time. But at least we need to understand why and not just see them as, you know, you're being difficult, you're making my life hard and getting pissed off at them. We can understand she's having difficulty. And so what we're doing is understanding her experience. What's the underlying challenge? So we want to be clear about what these unspoken rules are so she knows. I had one boy who asked me, all the boys were using words that were swear words. He didn't know swear words from non-swear words. So when a teacher said something, you know, that was corrective to him, he called her a part of the female body that's considered rude. Of course, the teacher was horrified. He didn't know what it meant. So he came to me and he said, would you please explain to me every word I'm not supposed to say? Well, that's a really hard thing to do. But there's a if you're not familiar with Ross Greene, please be familiar with Ross Greene, because he wrote a book called The Explosive Child. He also has a wonderful website called Lives in the Balance, and it's how to understand the perspective of a child who is perceived as non-compliant or who has difficulty. And we want to validate that child's point of view, because what they're experiencing all the time is a lack of validation. And we need to explain the idea of context, because remember, if you're very detail oriented, every context is going to look different to you. And we need to explain the idea of rules. What are rules and why are they there? I mean, if the child's not understanding that, we need to explain, well, with that boy, with the kid with the brownie who ended up in the principal's office, well, why do they have that rule? And yeah, it's understand the perspective. It is a stupid rule, but maybe there's other kids who only eat sweets and the child understands fair. And so maybe they can't have different rules for different people. And who enforces rules? Because sometimes these are the kids who will go around, and if you're supposed to be off the computer, they will unplug every computer. So kids don't like it when kids enforce rules. So again, talking about that. Language, these kids can be slow processors. They're also, as I said, literal. So they may say too much because they're telling every detail. They may process language slowly, as that boy was. And they have trouble with the main idea. And so they're focused on detail. And often when we ask a question, we want a short answer and you don't get it. They don't see the forest for the trees so and they can be stressed when they don't understand. And John Stewart is going to show you this.
What is the best sandwich?
Oh, geez. You know,
We're not playing here, John.
so you can't answer that question in terms of a particular sandwich. It has everything to do with the best sandwich is one that understands the bread to ingredient ratio and does not. So I can't
You're
say
not a
to you,
hoagie. You can't do a hoagie.
can't do a hoagie. It doesn't matter. What matters is the ratio of ingredient to bread and the addition of your liquidity, whether it be a condiment or
A pickle, let's say.
Well, John is totally floored by the pickle. But so what happens to little John, if that's the way he is when he's not being funny, and the teacher has short answer questions, or the teacher asks a question in class as simple as, well, what's your favorite whatever? And they give this kind of answer.
What is the best?
Oh, so we need to be concrete. We need to understand that if we say something like, the sink is full of dishes, the child's not going to understand you mean do the dishes. If you want her to do the dishes, say, look, I want you to do the dishes. If you want her to do the dishes now, say, I really want you to do the dishes now. She's not going to get what you're inferring. And it's important to be able to think specific, think literal, and communicate that way. And she is going to tell you everything, and that's the way she thinks. So we need to accept that, but we also need to be clear about the main idea. If we say, I want you to clean your room and grandma's coming, what you really mean is clean the stuff grandma will see. This is not the time when you want her to rearrange her closet or go through her drawers. So be clear, what exactly do you want? And processing speed can be an issue. That's one reason why it can be helpful to have things in writing. And that might be true at home. For some children who have trouble getting going in the morning, it can be very helpful to have a whiteboard where we write down exactly what we want them to do. In school, the older kids may need written study guides because they're not prioritizing. They're thinking every single thing. And if they ask you a question that's open-ended, they may try to give you every single thing they know. Or they may go hit on the wrong thing even when they know the right thing. If you look at this cafeteria, you can imagine all the sensory challenges. Imagine how noisy this place is, and imagine how, do you find this visually overwhelming? I do. Imagine the smells. They're cooking food there. Maybe some kids have just come from gym. Maybe somebody's wearing cologne. Imagine bumping into things. Imagine so many aspects of the sensory environment can be overwhelming to this kid that aren't overwhelming to other people. So your daughter will say in the car, it's way too loud, the music's too loud, and nobody finds it loud. So we see her as being selfish. She's not being selfish. It literally is her hearing is more acute and it is too loud for her. She may be sensitive to the lighting. She may, be turning off lights, or she may actually have a physical reaction to too much lighting. So we need to understand, we may say, I want you to hold still and listen to me. Some kids need to move to be able to listen. It's a sensory issue. Some kids need sensory information, sensory stimulation. And these are the kids who need fidgets, or they need squishies, or they need something to be able to actually be doing it in order to listen. Some kids need to be able to draw in it, and in order to listen. They're not ignoring you. What they're doing is doing what they need to be able to hear you. And if they're sensitive, we need to accommodate that. We need to find a way to turn down the volume. And it may be if they're siblings and they're really loud, this is a kid who needs headphones or noise canceling headphones. She may need earplugs. You may need to have a place in the house that's a quiet space. And there are other sensory needs. So if we know this, we need to think in terms of how do we make her environment one where she feels comfortable? Because imagine if you were in an environment that was just uncomfortable for you. There were flashing lights all the time, or there was super loud. Think of what that would be like. And so these kids do get emotionally dysregulated. These are the kids who do go 0 to 60, but it's not for nothing. There's always a trigger, but the trigger may be something that isn't picked up on, like something sensory, or like what they experience inside as a social demand, or a demand that they can't meet, or something that they can't, or it may be too many things at once. Imagine going into that cafeteria and there's the sound and the sight and the smell all at once. That might be too much. So or the kid may be asked to transition too quickly, and okay, I want you to get up and we're going to go now. We have to do this right now. And the kid melts down. It's not because the kid is just coming out of the blue. It's because there's something they're responding to. And what they're responding to may have happened a while ago, because so many of these kids work so hard to hold it together all day and not do something all day that's a misstep, or to stay focused, or to do what the teacher says. The teacher said, hold still, and the child is trying so hard to hold still that they walk in the door and melt down. And what you have is a kid who is so fried by the end of the day that she's just not able to hold it together anymore. And you talk to the school and they say, well, obviously there's something at home, because she's fine at school. But that's not the case. She's probably so overwhelmed by looking fine that she walks in, and maybe she can't do homework. Maybe she's so fried. So we need to think about that. This is a lot on a slide, but it's someone describing what it's like to have a meltdown. There's a difference between a meltdown and a tantrum. A tantrum is to get what you want. Kids melting down stay melting down, even when we give them what they want. And so the child doesn't need to be yelled at. And the thing about the stress response, which I'm sure most of you know, is when we have a stress response, when we're extremely emotional, the emotional part of our brain, the amygdala to be simplified, is what's in control, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that thinks, isn't online. And so if this is true for you too, if you are really stressed out because guests are coming and dinner is running slow and something else is going on, and your kid asks you, I have a bake sale tomorrow, you might snap at them because your amygdala is going strong. So these kids have an amygdala that's over the roof, this isn't the time to ask them to explain what's wrong. This isn't the time to try to talk to them about what's rational. It's time to give them a safe space, maybe a quiet space, or if they do well with being hugged, whatever it is that's helpful to them to calm down. But I can tell you in school, the assumption generally is that it's choiceful to get what they want. So emotional regulation, it's not a one size fits all thing. Somebody might tell you, well, just give them a break. That might work, that might not work. Mindfulness is being taught to meditate. I find teaching kids to meditate, making it part of their bedtime routine, can be incredibly helpful because they actually classically condition their bodies to lower the arousal level. But and I want to tell you that there are all kinds of meditation for your kids who also have ADHD. You can have a walking meditation, you can have a moving meditation, you can have a swimming meditation, but a meditation can be incredibly helpful. Mindfulness of exercises like just feeling where you are right now, or you can wash dishes mindfully. You can do almost anything where you're in the present and very aware. That can take you out of what you're in and bring you back to the present, because sometimes we're anticipating what's going to happen, or we're with what did happen, and our bodies have the same stress response as if it were happening at the moment. There are many sensory techniques, and OTs are incredibly helpful. There's the putty that you can get on Amazon. There's all a zillion kinds of fidgets. I had one kid who was helped by putting his hand in a bucket of sand. I never would have thought of that. I have one kid who was calmed by being allowed to be doing wall push-ups. So as some people who are very famous, like Temple Grandin, do well with weight or with pressure. Some kids have, there are all kinds of things. The question is, what works for this child? These kids can also have learning differences that are connected to their processing, connected to this underlying issues and wiring they have, whether it's with the fine motor skills of writing or math, because math can be very visual spatial. Geometry, if you don't get visual spatial presentation, then a geometry or charts or things like that can be very confusing. Reading comprehension, when you get past facts and you get into inferences, well, what's the main idea here? Well, how did this character feel? Well, if I don't understand social things and what real people feel, how do I know what a character feels? Or writing, if you've got all those ideas, all of those details in your head, then how do you know which ones to put on the paper? And I had one kid, she was in high school, and the way they were supposed to do it is they had to make an outline first, but she couldn't know what her priorities were till she'd written the whole thing. But they insisted she write an outline, and so her outlines weren't good because she didn't know what she was going to be wanting to say, and she didn't know what were the priorities. So, and the same thing as I said at home, she may not know what you're prioritizing, and that comes out in writing. And executive functions, many overlaps here with ADHD in terms of initiating things, in terms of breaking things down, in terms of time management. And I could do an entire talk on executive functions, but these kids have trouble with executive functions as well. They also have other things that coexist very frequently. If you're struggling to process the day, or to be social, or to transition because a substitute is here, or because they've changed the class schedule and you have an assembly and they're holding it together, they may experience anxiety, but your family may also have a history of anxiety disorders. The child may also have ADHD as well as whatever the NLD or the spectrum traits. And so we need to look at what other things are there. Many kids on the spectrum have sleep disorders. And if you're tired, if you're hungry, if there's something else going on with you, that's emotional arousal. Remember, they're not going to be able to perform as well at home, and they're not going to be able to perform as well at school. And there's one thing I didn't say before, which I want to say now, which is there's no such thing as a poster child. You're going to tell me, well, my kid can't be NLD because she's a good athlete, or my kid can't be on the spectrum because she does that. The fact is, no child has all of this. Every kid looks different. The question is, do they have enough of these things to kind of make this a useful way of thinking about them, a useful way of understanding what might be challenging and underlying behavior. So know her triggers. If she tends to go for the kids who are the deceptive and mean ones and go hot and cold, that, help her with that. Her sensory profile. If she's auditory sensitive, help think about, how do I make home a sensory friendly environment for her? How do we make it work? The challenges with pace if she's fried. The need to be clear and to explain that to everybody else, if you want something, you have to ask for it. If grandma expects a hug, then we need to explain that to her. But if she's touched and her sensory sensitivity is to touch, we might need to have grandma understand that she doesn't like the feeling of hugs. She may need to always plan on having a space for a break. If she shares a bedroom, it may need to be somewhere else in the house. And this is my other super important slide, which is that the child, these kids, these difficult kids, are invalidated all the time. They are told that what you're doing, how you do it, what you're saying is wrong. And if you hear that over and over and over, you grow up to be depressed. You grow up to have low self-esteem. And I'm going to give you a number that is on autistic kids. It can also be true for NLD kids. If you're constantly told that your ideas or your way of doing something is wrong, you tend to think of yourself that way. When you do post-high school planning, and that's required as part of the educational requirement, 75% of kids with learning differences participate. 50% of kids who have intellectual differences participate. Only 25% of these kids participate. Why? Because they've always been told they're wrong. So what they need is for us to validate their experience. This is where the Ross Green Lives in the Balance is so helpful, because it shows us how to do it. That you want to be sure, you want to ask enough questions to say, well, what's it like for you? Not just you did it wrong, or you should listen, or you should do this, but, well, what's your experience? And ask questions until you are sure you get it, and say, so let me get this straight. This is what this is like. And the kid says, yes. That's when you can introduce the idea, well, I really get it, but we also have to think about, this is what happens with that boy with the brownie. I said, look, I totally agree with you. Everything ends up in your stomach, but here's the problem. They're sticking with this rule. Do you like being in the principal's office? Well, no, because she missed recess. And, well, do you like missing recess? No. Well, then, even though it's a stupid rule, do you think you might want to do it so you get recess? Yes. So we help them problem solve, but understanding where they're coming from. And when we talk to the school, we need to communicate all this to the school. Why? Because they can't see it. Because this is what's going on inside, and this is an invisible problem. So the school is not going to recognize it. So we have to talk about all these things. We have to help them understand, this is what my child experiences. And unfortunately, with the school, if they don't get NLD, we have to focus on diagnoses they do recognize, whether it's a writing disorder, or there is a social communication disorder, or there may be an executive function, or there may be something in terms of math. We have to focus on the things that they know and accept. What we need to talk, and if a child has spectrum traits, we have to make sure they don't only write everything off as she's not doing that because she's on the spectrum. No, she may not be doing the math because she has problems with math. It's not because she's on the spectrum. Somehow they use that to explain everything, and that's not true. So we need to communicate with the school, because we are the experts. We know what is going on inside that's invisible. And for what it's worth, the Americans with Disability Act applies to schools too, even for invisible disabilities. So we take wheelchair ramps for granted. We take accommodations for deaf kids for granted. We wouldn't expect a kid who's in a wheelchair to be able to climb the steps. Kids with invisible diagnoses should be getting accommodations too. And that's just something that you're going to have to fight for. Strength-based learning can be so important because it gives them a sense of mastery. It gives them that self-esteem that balances out being wrong. My own daughter had a lot of learning differences, but she was extremely talented in the arts, and she was extremely talented as a singer. And that became the strength-based thing while she got the remediation she needed. But unfortunately, what happens is so often these kids get defined at the lowest level of their functioning. And we don't want to let them happen to them. But also at home, I had a girl who she was in high school and she wanted to be involved in the theater, but she wanted to do the makeup. And her parents, who were very type A, said, no, you've got to be on the stage. You want to be an actress. And she didn't want to be an actress. She wanted to do makeup. And I talked them into letting her do makeup. And you know what? She was a genius at makeup. She did so well at making everyone up for the theater that they had her do everybody for their famous Halloween experience at the school because she could do it better than anybody else. That became her strength. There might be a kid who's not any good at athletics, but is a terrific photographer. That child might take pictures of everybody doing athletics, and then everybody loves seeing their pictures on the bulletin board. Or the child may be strongest at video games. And this is the one child who can get to level 12 of this game. Your parents don't generally go upstairs and say, show me this thing you're so good at. Wow, I can't believe you do that so fast. Or it might be skateboard tricks. Whatever their island of strength is, go with that and appreciate it and care about it, because that's going to be a building block for confidence. And then that extends to other things, because if you feel I can be masterful and it can be appreciated, I can have people validate it, then we might take risks and go into other things, but they have to have something to build on. So this is a viral post from a teacher in a Facebook post, and it's talking about autistic kids. I always say this is true of all neurodiverse kids, and I always say this is true, and her point is, of all kids. If we respect their learning styles, if we understand their experience, if we give them the tools they need, they do well. And that's true for every single child. There is nothing that is catering to them about, say, being clear about what we want. And all kids do better if we are clear about what we want. So everything I've said in this talk applies to all kids of any kind of neurotype, of any kind of challenge, because they're all different. Thank you so much. I hope that this has been informative for you. And I'll turn it over to, I'm not sure who, to ask the questions.
That's me. Okay, so we have one question right now. Have you found that these girls often repeat themselves, even if using different words, but repeating the point over and over again? My daughter says she does this because her brain is in a loop.
Well, you know, that the fancy name for that is perseveration. And if she's repeating what she says, she may be looking for validation. For one thing, she may be, you know, giving you a detail that no one's really acknowledging because it seems off topic. Or she may be stuck on this, and we may have to help her, you know, understand that, ask her, well, for one thing, we want to validate her. What is this doing for her? You know, is it in some way self-calming? Is it in some way having a positive effect? If it's not, and she says, you know, I want to go on, then I want to move on, then, you know, using techniques like distraction. What's something else that she's interested in? Let her, maybe it's music, maybe it's playing a game, maybe it's going outside and going for a walk, something that takes her out of that loop. And it's specific to the child. But again, entertain the idea that it might be self-calming. And in that case, maybe we want to understand what is it that's going on that's making her want to calm herself by doing this. So distraction, if she wants out, understanding is the key.
We have a few more questions coming in. In the cases of learning later, late middle school and early high school, that your child has NLD, how do you approach it if you feel you missed opportunities for social development?
First and foremost, don't blame yourself. Okay. Even experts can miss this because, as I said, NLD is not recognized. It's not recognized by many therapists, and it's not recognized by many schools. So please don't kick yourself. So first of all, be positive about yourself and be positive about her. She may have come up with compensatory things on her own, or you might say, I kind of get it that this is hard for you. And maybe people haven't gotten that before. So what would you like? And let's come up with strategies. So maybe she goes to a birthday party and she always cuts out quickly. Well, what can she do to make it work better for her? Maybe it's approach one kid at a time. Maybe it's having a strategy to take breaks. And maybe she needs to ask to go to the bathroom so she can get out of there for a minute. Or maybe she needs to walk somewhere quiet for a minute. Or maybe there are strategies for, engaging that she does best if it's around a task. And so find something. I have one lady that I met who had terrible time engaging with other women, but she did great if it was around tasks. So, find an activity. So, start where you're at. And start where she's at, and assuming both of you have been doing the absolute best you can all the time, and start from there.
Okay, we have another question. This is actually a really good question that I was going to ask you myself if it didn't get asked. So I know you mentioned that the ADOS often misses these girls. Are there particular measures that you find to be more sensitive in picking up these features, or is it more of a clinical assessment?
My own bias is that it's more of a clinical assessment. You've got to really look at, even if she's at a lunch table, is she talking to the other kids? Is she what's happening with friendships? Is she what we want to do is not necessarily label her, although you need the label for services, is understand the constellation of what are the challenges that she has, and also understand that seeing every detail is a gift because she's going to come up with stuff that nobody else comes up with. And so so while I say it's clinical, the fact is, to get services, you have to have a label. And so we have to often do a workaround, and there are some tests that do look at. The one of looking at faces and identifying expressions is horrible. I can't do it either. But there's some where they're given social situations and they're asked how they would respond to them, or they're asked what's going on in the mind of it's called the test of problem solving. And there's some others push people to go beyond the normal battery of tests and to go into some things, but understand that what you do when you're in a one-on-one situation, it may not be what you do in the real world. So what we want to do is to get people to look at her in the real world and do observation in the real world. So the question's a great one, because on the one hand, schools will require us to have valid normed tests. And on the other hand, a lot of the valid normed tests are going to miss her. You might see that she's very literal and she's missing reading comprehension, or she's missing higher level language, but the tests only go up to a certain level. And I've talked to speech and language therapists. There aren't good tests that go to a higher level of language. So you're going to have to get a speech and language person who gets that, and who may have ways of being able to sort of document that the child is having those kinds of problems. So in a sense, we need people who are assessing her who will go out of the normal range and think out of the box to bring things in. That's what I did when I was testing, which was for 25 years, which is I would just keep going till I found something that documented what I wanted.
Okay, another question. Once the individual is an adult, is there any reason to discriminate the diagnosis between NVLD and ASD?
That's a really good question. You know, it depends on what your purpose is. Okay. I think that the diagnosis of ASD really depends on how many of these traits you have. And there's something called broad autism phenotype, which means you have a lot of these traits, but you don't meet criteria for autism. Um, and and a lot of NLD kids fall there. They don't quite meet criteria. The trick is, as an adult, are you in a place where you want to advocate for the accommodations you need, where you can explain, look, I just can't function well. I have very acute hearing. I can't function well in a noisy environment. And you want to, and you want your boss to be able to let you have a room that has a door, for example, or where you have trouble with transitions and you need to be able to not be interrupted or something. If you can advocate for what you need with or without a diagnosis, then that's fine. But if you need accommodations according to the ADA, you're going to need a diagnosis. And so that's where it comes in. And for many of these kids, and for many who are on the spectrum, I find that, and when they're adults, having a diagnosis can help them understand themselves, understand their gifts, the fact that they're detail oriented and analytic and get stuff that all these people who are super focused on things don't get, that it's funny. We look at honesty as a fault. Isn't that crazy? Having integrity is something bad, but actually honesty is great. And, we can help them understand that maybe sometimes people don't like it, but honesty, integrity is a terrific thing. But they need to understand, why did I always have such a hard time fitting in? I have so many adult women who've never been diagnosed who say, I've always felt like an alien. I've always felt like everybody else they downloaded the manual to being a person, and I didn't. And understanding that's not your fault. And they get told you're not trying hard enough. Okay. It's not that you weren't trying, you're just not processing. But you know what? If someone is clear and someone is direct, you do great. And look at who you are. You're loyal, you're honest, you're caring, you've got all of these strengths. See yourself. And if you get past that, people who know you will really appreciate that about you. So it really helps them accept and understand themselves with not so much blaming.
Okay, another question. What if the child, as they get older, does not want to get together with peers? Should the parent continue to arrange these play dates?
Well, the question is why? Okay. Why doesn't this child want to get together with peers? Does the child not want to get together with peers because they've spent the school day with peers and they're burned out? They just don't have anything left to try to listen and do all the things we do when we're being, quote, appropriate? Or is it because the child has had a lot of negative experiences and they've said, I don't want to go there? Is it because it's the being with peers is too noisy? Or is it maybe because the child really doesn't have peers who are sharing their interests, and it's kind of boring being with a whole bunch of kids who want to talk about something that you're just not into? And what they need to do is find people who are, who are more like-minded and who get them. If you're with people and they don't get you and they don't, that can be really hard. So the question is, what's the child's experience? And yes, there are a few people who really do prefer being alone. And I do see a few of those, but the majority have reasons. And what we want to do is understand what they are.
And there's another question kind of along those lines. And then there's one question after that. So just want to it looks like people are starting to drop off. If you do have a question, try to type it in now. So this question is, if it's hard for my kids to make friends, is it okay for me to tell them that it's okay not to make friends? I personally believe that it's okay not to have a lot of friends, and we shouldn't try so hard to make friends.
That's what I meant by validate your child, and look at their goals and their outcomes. If having one or two people who get you and who aren't mad if you aren't good at small talk, but who understand that you're direct and you're going to be honest and that's cool with them, then those are the people that you want to be with. And everybody doesn't have to be a social butterfly. So I think it's fine to tell a kid that, no, you don't have to make friends with everybody in class, find somebody who's your person. But they do need to understand that most people do have other friends. There's some interesting research for kids on the spectrum that autistic people get along perfectly well with other autistic people. And so if she can find some people who are like-minded and they're also quirky people, then she's going to do a whole lot better. I think about that when you think about college. Where's a place where it's okay to be different and it's okay to be quirky?
I completely agree with that. And there's many different resources around where people have social groups specifically for people who can relate to each other in that way. So that's great advice. Okay, so there's another question. It's a two-part question. My 14-year-old son presents like this. He has ADHD and severe social anxiety. He was diagnosed with 2/3 of the ASD criteria. What do we think of this? And do you know if snorts are a sensory thing or a true tic?
Good questions. I would, if he's diagnosed with 2/3, I would want to know, have they really looked at the other third? Or, have they done an adequate assessment? But if he does have 2/3, then we want to understand the constellation of challenges he does have. Sometimes people are saying, well, he doesn't fit this, and there are boys who can mimic social too. And there are boys who don't have obvious routines or obvious mannerisms or obvious behaviors, but a behavior can be very subtle. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm kind of doing this, okay, because it helps me focus. And so he may have things that are very subtle. So take a look at the subtleties, but if he's not meeting criteria, we still want to understand. I don't know about the snorting. It certainly could be a sensory thing. But you might want to differentiate that, talking to a neurologist as to differentiating tics and as opposed to a sensory thing. And if it's a sensory thing, I would think it would be, it would have a certain kind of a quality to it. Is there another sensory thing that can be a substitute? Because if there's another sensory thing that can be a substitute, when I did that, I felt the rush of air. It was a physical kind of experience. If he has a different physical experience, say with touching putty or with rubbing his arm or doing something else, can that help him? So I would maybe even work with an OT to see, is there another physical experience that would work? If not, then maybe it's a tic.
Okay, so we have two more questions. Do you have time for them, Dr. Eckert?
I do.
Okay, so the first question is, how do you handle a lack of desire to follow social norms? For instance, dressing a certain way could help the child fit in, but the child refuses. It's not a sensory thing, so I just don't understand it.
Well, these kids are often kids who, quote, march to the beat of their own drum. Okay. And Ross Greene has, in his book, he has 3 baskets of things, and it depends on how much you need to pay attention to them. Basket C is stuff that really doesn't matter. Basket B is stuff that does matter, like doing your homework and, brushing your teeth, things like that. And basket A is safety. The only things you always have to fix is basket A. Okay, if your kid thinks running out of the building and running across the street is a good thing to do, you have to change that. Okay, anything that is unsafe has to be addressed. Basket C, if your child, for one thing, it may be sensory, because these kids can be very sensitive to the feel of fabric or even to the tightness. So everybody else may have made jeans, but this kid may be finding jeans incredibly uncomfortable and may prefer to wear sweatpants, or may prefer to wear a top that's sort of soft and loose. So I would help the child understand this thing about fitting in, but I would also understand that if, hey, this is my personal statement about me, then it's a kind of basket C kind of thing. And I don't know that I would make life about that.
And then one last question. Have you ever seen extremely high visual spatial scores, or would that exclude the diagnosis?
It would exclude let me put it this way, it would exclude an NLD diagnosis, unless there's some aspect. One of the things about when they do testing is that there are all kinds of subtests. And if you have one very high subtest and other tests that are low and they average it all together, it can look high, but actually you've got these areas of deficits. So if the kid is very good in one thing, but has weak visual memory or other weak things in visual, they may still be NLD. But most of the people on the spectrum are quite good visual processors, and in fact do process visually. So I would again look at the constellation of challenges and think, does this constellation helpful? Does this make sense? And go from there.
That's great.
I actually I wanted to say one thing to follow up, Marcy, if this sounds right to you, about the tick question. I don't know how old that child is or when the tick started, but if that child also has ADHD or is taking a stimulant, maybe those ticks started when he or she started taking the stimulant, you could tell whether or not that's, a tick or something sensory. I know that my kid, when he started taking a stimulant, got all kinds of tics that he had never had before, and that when he stopped, they started to taper off.
Oh, thanks so much, Eve, for including that. Believe it or not, I don't think of absolutely everything. So that's a really, really important point. If the tick started when something else was started, then wonder if it's combined, if it's typical of stimulants, but pretty much think of anything, and could it be a reaction to that?
Yeah, it's so hard to address those because you don't know, if it's a tick, you don't want to draw attention to it because then it gets worse. But if it's just so hard. I've lived through this myself too. You don't know what to do.
Yeah. And also tics can also reflect stress and anxiety. When I was having to go through 1,500 hours of supervised work in order to get licensed as a psychologist, I was doing part of it from teaching, and I was teaching something that was incredibly difficult and that got in order to do it, you got a lot of negative response. And I had a tic for like 12 weeks just out of the stress of that class. So also wonder, could this be a stress response? And what might be so stressful? That's another one to rule out.
Right.
I don't see any other questions, and we've had a significant amount of people log out. So it's probably a good time to end. But thank you so much, Dr. Eggert.
It sounds great.
Really
Also, we have a lot of Dr. Eckert's articles that we'll be sending out along with the video recording. And they are also on our website in a number of places under Dr. Eckert's More About, and on the homepage under Focus on ASD and Autism.
And Dr. Eggert, your blog, we'd want to include that as well, along with the information we send out with the video. So make sure we have that, okay?
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.